thank you for joining us today, Rachel. As you know, Launchpad is Reading's homelessness prevention charity, and we work with agencies across the town to support people who are homeless or at risk of losing their home. And in the run-up to the election in December, we're speaking to prospective parliamentary candidates in Reading West about some of the key issues affecting our clients and how they plan to tackle the housing crisis. So if we kick things off with you telling us about yourself and your background.
Thank you, and hi everyone, thank you so much for giving up your time to listen to me and ask some questions this morning. I'm Rachel. I've been a councillor here in Reading since 2010, and I was actually first came across Launchpad in my work as a councillor when I was the lead councillor for housing from 2011 to 2013, which you can remember that far back. Things were difficult then, but I think things have probably got harder for you all now, though obviously I knew Launchpad's work prior to that just as a member of the public. I live in Reading West, and I've represented Whitley Ward for 9.5 years now, since 2010, and I'm really passionate about our community. As I say, my family are being brought up here, my children are going to a local school, and I also run my own small business here as well, so it's really important to me to stand in Reading West. I'm standing on this wonderful manifesto, but specifically my pledges to you all are that there'll be a public say on Brexit to resolve that issue. I would personally campaign to remain in that, but your vote would be worth the same as mine, so if you had a disagreement with me, you could just vote to leave. I'm campaigning to tackle climate change, that's my second big commitment. And the third area of commitment is I am campaigning to get more investment in our communities and our local services. I think the decimation of both public services and the impact that's had on our local charities and other community groups has been really noticeable, and it's kind of accelerating. I think we need to put an end to that and actually invest in things like preventing homelessness and tackling the housing crisis that we've got in this area.
Great. So if we start, I'll ask you a few questions, then we'll go out to the audience and they will ask questions, and I'll repeat them for the sake of filming. But if we touch on rough sleeping, so there's an estimated over 4,600 people sleeping rough in England, and an annual count of rough sleepers by Reading Borough Council in November last year found 25 people sleeping rough on the streets in our town. What do you think is the best approach to preventing homelessness and reducing these numbers?
So I think that's absolutely vital. I think we can judge a society on how we treat the people who are the most vulnerable, and very often the people who end up on our streets have had huge numbers of issues that have led to that, and you all know that probably better than anyone. I think there's two strands. There's firstly, we need to tackle the issue of rough sleeping and support those who are already rough sleeping. The Labour manifesto talks about this winter tackling that and pushing emergency funds in place to help get people out of the streets. Obviously yourselves, the council and others do a lot over the winter to help people. Our severe weather emergency protocol, I think, is something we can be very proud of, but I think we need a lot more resource for that, and I think that's really important. But then there's the second part of what you asked about, which is preventing it, and of course that's really complicated. It's not about a lovely soundbite. Actually, it's going to take looking at how we support people through mental health issues, how we tackle the cost of housing. We need to do a huge amount, so whether it's by massively increasing a council house building programme, whether it's about reinvesting in mental health services, whether it's about helping charities like Launchpad with some of the work you do around people who are at risk of becoming homeless. Those are the ways that we achieve the ambition of preventing anyone from needing to sleep rough on our streets.
Okay, so many of our clients are forced into private rented accommodation because of the huge lack of social housing in Reading, but the weekly rent payments for private rented accommodation are well above the local housing allowance. So for example, the benefit for a room in a shared accommodation is £81.14 a week, but the average rent for a room in Reading is £115 a week. How will you plan to resolve this issue?
Yeah. So this is something that was a policy decision. This hasn't happened by accident. It was one of the early things that George Osborne did when he was Chancellor. And I think that what we predicted would happen at the time, so I was Housing League, we predicted this at the time, that when you do that sort of thing, then if you say we're going to just increase rents in line with inflation and not in line with the actual increase in housing rents or with wages, then housing allowance will start to fall behind. And the first couple of years you do it, it's just a little bit and it doesn't make too much notice. But by the time you get to the point now, the reality is that it's very difficult to find rental accommodation that is within the local housing allowance. So there's a couple of things to do. One is to sort that out so that the housing allowance actually reflects what it costs to find housing, because that's kind of the point of it. But then secondly, making sure that we have a massive increase in the availability of social housing. Not because everybody wants a council house, although a lot of people do, but because if you've got a lot more council houses available, that helps the people who get that council house, but also relieves the sort of intense competition there is for the private rented sector, and so it makes that the pressure on that market less severe.
So on that note, there are 4,710 applications in Reading on the waiting list for social housing. So do you plan to build more affordable housing in Reading?
Yes, absolutely. I think what's really great about the Labour manifesto is it talks about supporting councils and funding councils to be able to build. I think Reading Borough Council's actually got as good a record as it can, given the constraints on them and on us, to build council housing. We've been sort of finding ways of doing it by almost by hook and by crook, finding little sites, looking for where we can find funding, where we can find some headroom in our budget to build council housing. But we need a lot more, and I think that that's the kind of housing development people will support, because what people want is housing for local people, housing that will help people who are on low paid jobs, some of the very vital jobs that we have in our community. You know, when you've got teachers and nurses not being able to afford to live in Reading, then you know you've got a problem.
And do you think right to buy should be abolished? Because obviously in the 80s that was introduced. Has that had an impact, and is it something that we shouldn't be doing now?
Yeah, so personally, I think that if people want to buy their council house, they should pay proper price for it, and then that money can be used to reinvest. So I think it also should be down to the choice of the local authority. So some local authorities, the right to buy works for, not brilliantly, because the money gets sent often back into central government, but for some local authorities there's been some advantages to it, places where they've got a housing surplus. I don't think it really works for someone like Reading, so I think that it should be down to the local area and the local authority to decide. And I think that if you're buying your council house, then there should be almost a one-for-one replacement, or even maybe slightly more than one-for-one replacement.
Okay, a huge barrier our client group faces with securing accommodation is finding landlords or estate agents who will accept benefits or rent guarantee schemes.
Yeah.
Even when they have a good track record of paying rent and on time, this is often something that they won't go anywhere near. What does your party plan to do about this, and do you think that that approach is discrimination?
So I think that firstly we need to rebalance the power in the private rented sector. It's not to penalise good landlords, but just to rebalance the power. So that's one of the things that you'll see in the Labour manifesto. Obviously the manifesto is a summary of our detailed policies, but you'll see that talk about the rebalancing of the power, and I think that will help. But I think that if you find that right now landlords have got to can pick and choose, and that's the danger. If we actually change the power balance a little bit, that will mean that there's better, it likely reduces the possibility of that happening. But I do think it's discriminatory if you're going to turn someone away just because of their benefits situation.
Okay. We see many landlords letting properties in substandard or unsafe conditions, yet they still charge high rates. Are there any plans to tackle this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So rogue landlords is a real issue now. I remember, this would be back in 2011, going round some of the private sector housing that the council was taking enforcement action with, and it was our environmental health team that took me around, and it genuinely left me in tears, one of the visits I did, because it was a family who had a daughter the same age as my own daughter, who was quite young at the time, and it just was appalling. So absolutely proper prosecutions and tackling of that, but also supporting good landlords, or the landlords in the middle. You've got great landlords, you've got rogue landlords, and you've got the sort of bulk of landlords who, they're not rogues, they're not trying to let bad property, but they may need some support. And I actually think one of the great things that we're promising about refurbishment of properties and increasing it's actually part of our climate change agenda, but it's about properly insulating our housing stock across the country, not just the private rented sector, and making our homes fit for the future. I think will also have a big benefit for private renters.
Okay. If we put questions out to the audience, does anyone have anything to ask? Yeah.
I've got a long list. I was planning to ask these questions to all the different people that came in, so I've got the same list. So the first thing I'd ask is, do you think local councils have the resources to implement the Homeless Reduction Act appropriately?
The short answer to that is no. The long answer to that is that, of course, there are some things that you can do, and politics is always about priorities. So some councils will prioritise it, and I think that Reading Council is a good example of a council that's trying to prioritise this. You know, I'm not saying they get it right all the time, or as councillors we get it right all the time, but yeah, so the long answer is some councils are prioritising it and doing more, other councils are not prioritising it, but the short answer is I don't think councils have enough resources to do all the things that they really ought to be doing. So there's almost more duties on councils than they really can achieve.
You got another one?
Oh, I'll keep going down my list unless anyone wants to interrupt me.
Maybe do a couple more and then we'll see if
Sure.
anyone else has.
So for our client group, a lot of people would end up working in the town centre. Obviously, we know there's a lot of kind of problems with high streets and town centres at the moment.
Yes.
What are your plans to kind of tackle that issue?
Yeah, absolutely, and I've worked very closely. Actually, funnily enough, this notebook was given to me by Ustor Trade Union, who are the trade union for shop workers, and there's a huge amount of issues around this, and some of it is the kind of soft stuff. And as a local MP, you can be very active in your community, promoting things. So, for example, I actually do this really in my work as separate to being a politician, is promoting small businesses around Small Business Saturday, which is coming up. That kind of soft stuff is important, but then you've got the hard policy changes as well. So, for example, business rate reform is really needed, so that there's a level playing field for high street businesses and the online shopping retailers. Because it's not to say that, you know, we all want to be able to buy online now and again, but I think we also all want to have that high street that we can come into that's vibrant, that's positive. You know, I mean, Reading's probably doing better than a lot of places, but I think that's not something we should take for granted. I think we do need that hard policy reform to make sure that our high streets, which I think are really important for our communities, stay vibrant. So yeah, it's a really good question. There's quite a bit in our manifesto about this actually, if you want more detail.
I'll keep going. So we work with a lot of people that do have a substance misuse problem. Do you think the UK's drug policy is working, and do you think it's fit for purpose?
So I could answer that with one word, which is no. I don't think it is working very well. How do you resolve it is quite complicated. So, for example, you know, we're looking at allowing medical use of cannabis, and that's in our manifesto, on prescription. I don't think that will necessarily solve the issue, but I think that sort of thing needs to be looked at, and I think we need to modernise our drugs policy. I also think we need to have better treatment for people and better support for people, because even if you take a legal drug like alcohol, and I'm not in the business of saying we shouldn't have alcohol, but equally, actually, it can be a real scourge for many, many people, and criminalising versus non-criminalisation doesn't actually necessarily solve problems. If you look at alcohol misuse, you can go into any shop almost and buy some alcohol, but the problem usage really needs to be looked at, and I think that goes back to mental health issues. It's about making sure that we properly invest in supporting people. And I mean, you guys know a lot about this, so I would want to come and listen to you about what you think we can do better.
Can I add to that
Yeah.
point? May I ask a question on the drugs? It obviously affects so many of the Launchpad clients. What would you propose in terms of preventing drug use as opposed to treating it?
Yeah, but I think
that is so vital.
Really. I agree. I mean, people are always going to say education, and I think that is true. I think that if you hide something from, say, to take young people, if you try and hide something from them, they're going to find out about it. I mean, even when I was growing up, you know, you knew what was happening, even if you weren't told about it in school. But now, with people being able to just go on the internet, on their phones, educating our young people, teaching them about it from a young age, about the dangers of misuse, not kind of scaremongering to them, not kind of demonising, alcohol or any other substance, but educating them about the effects has got to be a starting point. And then when people are going down a certain path, just getting people to be aware of the dangers. Mental health issues I think often cause drug dependencies, so we also need to look at how do we become a more resilient society and how do we support people with mental health issues. And I know from having seen friends when I was growing up that actually people sometimes drugs would help to cause mental health issues, but they would also usage would sometimes be a result of mental health issues. So I think that's something as well.
Any other questions?
Final one from me. What benefits will leaving the EU bring to people that use our service?
I was asked this at Hustings, and not about your service in particular, but just generally. And I could again answer this quite quickly, but I would judge any policy on, does it make our community better off and stronger? Does it unite us as a country and bring us together? And does it make our voice stronger in the world? I would say Brexit fails on all three of those. I think that the impact on our NHS is going to be severe, particularly with recruitment. I think the danger of our economy is being sort of damaged by Brexit is definitely something that's going to come to fruition if we have Brexit. And I'm also concerned about cohesion in society and the rise in tensions between different communities. And I think that Brexit has, the talk of Brexit, even just the referendum on its own, created increased tensions and division between people, and that really worries me. It's one of the reasons why I would campaign to remain in the European Union if we do have another referendum.
Any other questions?
Just one more, sorry, from me. I just wondered whether you could clarify whether Labour's policy is still to scrap the bedroom tax.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
And if it's not, if it ever changes, I will be the first in the queue. Well, maybe not first, I'll be racing to the front of the queue to get that change back again. But yeah, if it ever changes, I would.
Anyone else? I've got one last one.
Yes.
So over the summer there was a consultation process on the abolition of Section 21.
Yes.
What is Labour's stance on no-fault evictions, and what does your party plan to do about them if you do get into power?
Yes. So our position is that we would effectively abolish Section 21 evictions. That's not to say that we wouldn't allow landlords who needed to evict someone for a good reason, so a tenant who was causing trouble or something like that. We would make sure that landlords had the opportunity to evict for those reasons, or non-payment of rent, those kind of things. But no fault evictions, I think we've said very clearly. I don't think we actually mentioned the word Section 21 in the manifesto. Maybe that's a bit geeky for the general reader, but for me, I was looking for it because I am the geeky kind of reader. And what we said is we would end no fault evictions.
Great. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, if I am fortunate enough to be elected to Reading West MP, I've always worked closely with Launchpad. I've always cared very deeply about the issues that you tackle. So please, look out for the result. And if I'm in, please get in touch with me. I want to come and visit you and listen to what I can do as your MP. And for me, politics is not just about climbing a career. It's definitely not about Westminster's greasy pole for me. It's about representing our community. So if I get elected, please have me back and hold me to account for what I've said today and what I've said in my leaflets, and see what I can do to help you, because you do an amazing thing for our town.